Okay. 3, 2, 1. How's it going? What's the crack? My name's Connor Smith. I'm an Irish writer in Berlin. It's the January blues. The serotonin's in the toilet, so I thought today I would talk about something upbeat. Specifically, we're going to be looking at this, one of the most interesting and well-known pieces of internet writing in the past few years. This is a manifesto written by the most famous incel on the internet, Elliot Rodger. It's extremely detailed, and of course it's an absolutely horrible piece of work. A little bit of context. So in 2014, a 22-year-old former student at the university in Isla Vista in Santa Barbara, California, killed his 2 roommates and a 3rd person in their apartment. He uploaded a video titled Elliot Rodger's Day of Retribution. In the video, he basically talked about the killings he was going to do, blamed the women who wouldn't sleep with him and the men who got to sleep with the women who wouldn't sleep with him.
It all has to come to this. Tomorrow is the day of retribution, the day in which I will have my revenge against humanity, against all of you.
He also emailed out a long manifesto / autobiography, which we're going to be looking at in this video. After he posted his video and announced what he was going to do, he went to a local sorority house with the aim of killing basically as many hot girls as possible, but they wouldn't let him in the house, so he ended up kind of driving around the town, shooting people or hitting people with his car. Eventually the police caught up to him and he killed himself in his car. Killed 6 people and he wounded 14. But let's back up even further here. So what is an incel? If you've been lurking around in the crevices of the internet like I have, none of this is new. But if you're like a normal person with a normal life, maybe you need a little bit of a catch up. Incel is a portmanteau of involuntary celibate. It originated in the 90s. Canadian student who had the pseudonym Alana, a website in which she talked about her involuntary celibacy, and she used the word incel. The idea here was to basically have a place where people who were sort of lonely or awkward or not socially great could share experiences and support each other as they tried to find romantic and sexual partners and struggled with it. So it was really a kind of place of empathy and support. Then came dudes on the internet. Over the next few years, as the online manosphere would start developing, the incel community would grow. Basically, it's a large spectrum, but we can say that it's really mostly heterosexual white men who can't get laid and are really pissed off about it and really hate women because of this. Now, again, there's a range here. At one end, harmless enough 16 and 17-year-olds who like engineering and anime and just can't really talk to women and need a way of like identifying with other people. Down the radicalization chain, you have these communities that basically resemble suicide cults or jihadi camps. At the most extreme end, you get people posting wild fantasies of like violence and sexual violence, and of course some of them end up acting out some of these things. They might kill themselves. You know, this is a strongly nihilistic, depressing community, or they might carry out attacks.
That deadly van attack in Toronto.
He allegedly harassed women and in one case pepper sprayed people.
It is the first time in Canadian history a judge has ruled a first-degree murder a terrorist act inspired by the incel ideology.
And in these extreme communities, someone like Elliot Rodger is regarded as a kind of folk hero. He's a guy who put his money where his mouth is and took his fantasies into the real world. Now, one of the weird quirks here is that Elliot Rodger never actually described himself as an incel. That term didn't really exist when he was doing what he was doing. He is in these communities regarded as a kind of like OG, the sort of John the Baptist of the shagless. In subsequent acts of violence, attackers often mention Elliot Rodger as a kind of inspiration. Even if he didn't kind of identify himself in this way, his extreme thinking mark him as like an archetype of this kind of personality. And it's worth paying attention to these kind of communities because they're just one part of a nexus of male-generated content that is skeptical or hostile towards feminism, towards liberalism, towards things we consider normal parts of modernity. There's a lot of really bad, really insecure people on the internet across podcasts and YouTube shows and message boards, and every day they prey on vulnerable men. And when it comes to Rodger and his manifesto, yes, it's the ravings of a lunatic. I mean, by the end, he's fantasizing about putting every woman in his own personal concentration camp. But even lunacy isn't totally neutral. As we get into the document, we're going to see that for all of his madness, Rodger was also a kind of product of his historical moment. And if we look at things like this, we can maybe learn something about what's going on in the culture and what we might have to be worried about. First, we're going to look at the document itself, and then I'm going to take you through some of the things that I noticed. I've read through this thing twice, and there are certain kind of themes or takeaways that I think are worth focusing on. But yeah, first, the actual thing itself. What is it? So this is a PDF. It's 137 pages, longer than the average doctoral thesis, and Rodger wrote it in the weeks before his attack. It's partly a memoir. It starts when he was very young. It goes through his whole life. It's partly a sort of manifesto where he outlines his weirdo sexual fascism. It's also a retroactive justification for the killings, how terribly women have treated him, and why what he's doing is really a kind of counterattack. Presumably Rodger was drawing from his actual journals because there's so much detail here. It starts when he was basically an infant. It goes through in exhausting detail all the minutiae of his past 22 years. Rodger and his family moved to America from England. His family had a bit of a background in film production. They had a little bit of money, it seems. His dad was a director of middling success. He ended up being a second unit director for the Hunger Games film. Rodger is quick to remind us that his mum at one point dated George Lucas. So there's a bit of a family legacy here. In the States, as a child, Rodger is insecure. He's jealous. He doesn't like kids getting a bigger slice of cake. He doesn't like adults paying other people attention. The father is kind of distant because he's working so much. His mother dotes on him and indulges him, gives him everything he wants. He's extremely comfortable life. He has really anything he needs. As a child, he struggles to make friends, to connect with other people. Eventually, when he's in middle school and then high school, he gets bullied because he's kind of shorter than other people. He has no self-esteem, really, no confidence. He can't make proper friends. He's obsessed with being cool, with pressing people. He learns how to skateboard. He dyes his hair blonde. He doesn't fit in with the popular kids. Rodger writes in a kind of Lapsarian structure. So childhood is a heavenly, carefree existence, and then puberty comes, hierarchy arrives, sex arrives, everything falls apart. In high school, he's bullied very severely. It's clear that what he's experiencing is extreme social anxiety, extreme depression. His parents try to help him. He struggles a lot. He ends up moving around schools. He doesn't really make friends. He gets addicted to World of Warcraft. He's terrified of girls. He doesn't know how to approach them, talk to them. And it's around puberty that he takes his loneliness and his rage, and he goes to Barnes and Noble and he discovers the history of fascism.
Here we go.
Things escalate. Rodger gets more and more isolated. His ideas around women and sex become more and more extreme. Revenge on his bullies, revenge on the world. Eventually, he's totally trapped within his own weird world. He gets triggered all day, every day. It's delusional. The world is against him. It's such an injustice that people don't recognize what a wonderful, amazing person he is. He goes to a party, he gets a little drunk. He tries to push some women off a balcony. He starts throwing coffee over women in the street. He has to drop out of school because, there's maybe a hot woman in his class. Things get darker and weirder, and he starts buying guns and knives, and he starts planning for something. It ends just before the attack. Rodger blames everybody else for what's about to happen, claims he's the good guy, forced to do this by an unjust, uncaring world. And that's the outline. When it comes to the form itself, like the writing, it's so long, it's so boring. There's so much minutiae about the new World of Warcraft or what games he played on the N64. And then in the next paragraph, he's talking about boiling women alive. He writes with this kind of affected, vaguely aristocratic tone. He describes things as being exquisite or wonderful. He talks about himself as being an intelligent gentleman. There's a kind of Trumpian quality. You can see the kind of like absence of self, the insecurity mixed with these grand statements and this overbearing language. Okay, enough wiffle waffle. Let's do some analysis. We're going to go through 3 different ideas or takeaways from the text, and you want to see that they're all kind of related. So, first, Let's put on our materialist hats and let's see if we can do a little class reading of the text. In the nucleus of the incel community, and across other related communities like, say, the red pillars or the alpha males, one of the key drivers is a sense of romantic entitlement. And in Rodger's text, we can see how romantic entitlement can sit alongside or be an expression of a more general social or class entitlement. Rodger lives a very comfortable upper middle class existence. At the start of the text, he talks about his family's aristocratic history of a fortune lost somehow. And as we read, we see that money, the power and status that comes with it are a key part of his worldview. He brags about all the fancy flights he took as a kid, holidays, the airport business lounge. His family's luck goes up and down a little, but his dad does pretty well overall. They live in a 3-story mansion at one point. He goes to film premieres, VIP concert tickets. He rubs it in the reader's face. He's incredibly snobby. When his parents divorce and his mom has to move into an apartment, he's too embarrassed to bring people round. The text is full of these brand signifiers, this consumerist language. Armani's shirt, video game console, the BMW his mom buys him. Rodger never has to work. He's nagged by his mom into getting a job, but he quits immediately because he's asked to clean some toilets. This is something for the lower classes. As the text goes on and Rodger's self-confidence plummets, he comes to rely more and more on these kind of consumerist items to impress people. There's one kind of funny part where he's in college and he buys his new Armani shirt and he gives himself a little pep talk in the mirror, and then he goes to class and he's distraught when no one comes up to him and compliments him. Rodger complains so much about all this attention that he's not getting. He never does anything to improve his situation. He really thinks that if he just walks around, people will throw themselves on the ground in front of him. And when no girls come up to him and start chatting him up, he goes home in tears. Reading this, it made me think of Patricia Highsmith's Ripley or Bret Easton Ellis's Patrick Bateman, two portraits of a synthetic American masculinity and the kind of rage that it hides. And of course, since we're talking about hierarchy, superiority, bloodlines, inevitably we get some weird race stuff. Rodger is half white, half Malaysian. Nothing triggers him like seeing a hot white blonde with a Hispanic or black guy. And we know from like investigations of these kinds of communities that there's a strong white supremacist or Nazi element to them. This talk of aristocracy, this firstborn entitlement, made me think a lot of Shakespeare's Richard III, especially the opening monologue where he's envious of the Duke of York, his Labrador jock rival.
Now, instead of mounting barbed steeds to fright the souls of fearful adversaries, he capers nimbly in a lady's chamber to the lascivious pleasing of a lute. But I, that am not shaped for sportive tricks, nor made to court an amorous looking glass, I that am rudely stamped, deformed, dogs bark at me.
But apart from the specific language here, we can zoom out a bit and think about the way that Rodger structures the social world. For him, it's a individualistic, hostile contest for finite resources, a competition where another person's gain is your loss. Now, we know from theory that we can often read culture as a kind of expression or echo of underlying economic relations. When it comes to like dating discourse, for example, we can see this in the sort of normalized way that people talk about, say, the sexual marketplace and the implication that we all have some sort of value within that marketplace, fluctuating up and down like a stock or a pension bond. I mean, the subject of how capitalism has captured romantic discourse is something for maybe a longer video. So let's move on. Second concept, sex as a super object. Now, what does this mean? First, let's think about sex as an object. When it comes to online dating discourse, sex is usually configured as a kind of item. It's something that can be acquired or exchanged, like a kilo of wheat or a Rolex. It's not really an event in time. I mean, it's a kind of commodity. This is really obvious with something like pickup artist culture. Pickup artists were guys who got mainstream attention in the noughties thanks to Neil Strauss's book, The Game, and a MTV reality show. They're basically like cringy Lotharios, insecure guys who dressed up and used pop psychology to get women at the clubs. And they were a kind of precursor to a lot of current male communities. They're still sort of floating around, running sort of these pickup boot camps at your local city centre. But these kinds of guys operated on a acquisition model, and we can see how that permeates a lot of dating discourse. It's really about how to get something and not so much what to do when you get it. In this discourse, sex is always kind of equal to itself. There's no real modify an adjective. It is a thing one is able to sort of get or not. But what is a super object? So I just made this up. But what I'm trying to get at is we have these objects in discourse that are so overburdened with meaning, they move into abstraction. They're not really connected to actual like experiences in the world. And you can see this kind of thing in like political discourse when we're using abstract nouns like Western civilization or tradition or Brexit. These aren't really like stable objects. They're sort of like emotional buckets. This gap is especially true with people like the incels because their whole worldview is defined by this thing that they don't have or can't get or don't really know anything about. And there's no curiosity in Rodger's text. Like these people are mostly not really interested in like the thing itself and like learning about it. You know, they worship at the altar of an absence. And even if they kind of get the thing, there's a sense that it will never work because there's just too much symbolic weight. The object can't really hold in the world. Okay, tangent. So related to this, I want to talk about disgust. There's this great little bit in the text where Rodger is at a computer cafe and he sees someone watching. It's his first time actually like seeing people having sex. And this inspires in him this like trauma, this disgust. This guy is obsessed with getting this thing and how awful it is the women won't give it to him. But he also kind of hates it. Traumatized by the idea of it. I think there are like a few ways you could read this. So one is pretty much the normal like teenager who is afraid of adult stuff. You know, Rodger has a kind of Peter Pan thing going on. There's also, I think, something here about control. You know, it's pretty normal in like authoritarian regimes to legislate and police around sex. And Rodger is so repelled eventually by the whole idea. He dreams of a dystopia where sex is outlawed, where desire is gone. And I mean, obviously this is crazy, but this is kind of interesting because what he wants is not simply like a world without sex. He wants a world without desire. I think that's part of the trauma here. He's upset not just by the idea of the thing, but he's upset by having to have desire in the first place. Like desire is disruptive. It means that you might have to rely on other people to fulfill these desires. Getting the thing you want might require cooperation or consent. I think at some level, the discovery of sex is the discovery that other people might exist. Okay, last idea. Women as a kind of technology. Someone like Rodger can't really wrap his head around the idea that like other people exist, that these women around him are just living their life, that the things they do or don't do aren't judgments on him. The things that stands out in the text is how few actual conversations Rodger has with a girl. He seems to have maybe 2 conversations with a woman who's not in his family. He ends up seeing them as a kind of like machinery when they're not fulfilling their job. Then there's something wrong with him. His rage is the rage at a toaster that won't work or a car that won't start. One way we might conceptualize or measure liberation of a particular group is the extent to which they have to be a service or technology for some other group. So we can see this with the history of the working class or with slavery. This also works with like historical patriarchy. You think about the relations between the sexes historically and the way that women function as a kind of technology, like a biological, child-rearing technology, or domestic, or a kind of like psychological or emotional technology. They're there to sort of mend wounds and flatter and reciprocate. And when I look at the current state of male discourse on the internet, I sense a kind of aggrievement, a frustration that this machinery isn't working the way it used to, that the toaster is talking back.
Here, Mr. Smith, I'm going to lunch with Mother.
Right, let's call it. Enough of this guy. See you at the next one. I feel like I need a shower.